Hi, welcome to SYNAPSE Talks from SYNAPSE U of T. In this podcast, we chat with professionals in neuroscience to learn more about their work, careers, and insights.
I'm Melina, a third-year student pursuing a double major in neuroscience and human biology.
And I'm Faryat, a fourth-year student specializing in journalism. Today, our guest is Dr. Joordens, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto Scarborough and director of the Advanced Learning Technologies Lab. Dr. Joordens earned his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of New Brunswick and later completed his PhD at the University of Waterloo. Following a postdoc at McMaster University, where he explored models and empirical studies of human memory, he joined the University of Toronto Scarborough in 1995.
With a multitude of experience as a faculty member and as part of the prestigious Teaching Academy at the University of Toronto, Dr. Joordens has made significant contributions to the study of human memory, conscientiousness, and the future of education. From peer assessment to critical thinking and the innovative use of technology in classrooms, his research is shaping the way we learn and understand our minds. Dr. Joordens, thank you for speaking with us today. We're thrilled to learn more about you and your work.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be with you all today.
Perfect. So let's dive into some questions about research and academia. So what inspired you to pursue psychology, and how did your academic journey shape your career focus on memory, conscientiousness, and educational psychology?
Yeah, so, originally it took me a while to decide to go to university. I tried to avoid it for a number of times. When I finally did, I started in January, so I kind of somehow did things unconventionally, and nobody was watching as much when you start in January. And so I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I took a lot of computer science courses, and I took a lot of psychology courses. And I was kind of thinking music producer, which is what I imagined. And I thought the psychology would help me get the best out of the musicians, to know how to kind of work with them. And the computer science, well, everything seemed to be going digital at that time. So it seemed like the place to be. The road turned when I took one course, and this is always interesting. For me, I like to highlight this experience, a course in cognition taught by a guy named Professor Wayne Donaldson. And at one point, after all these assessments, he had a very different way of assessing than other professors. He just took me aside at some point and said, "You think like a scientist." And I never thought I thought like a scientist. I didn't, but he always asked us, what would you do next if you were the scientist? And apparently the ideas I had, he thought were good. And he said, you should slow down, do less courses, get your grades up, and think about graduate school. Think about going to psychology in grad school. And so that, for some reason, I don't know why, I was flattered, I guess, and I liked this guy a lot, and I just allowed him to be my mentor and basically followed his advice, and it's largely why I am where I am. So,
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah.
Your research spans conscious and unconscious influences. Could you explain how these two aspects of human cognition interact and why they're so important to study?
Yeah, and so, I like my stories. So the funny little story there is I applied at University of Waterloo to do my PhD, and I was rejected. And so I did something I advise all my students to do. Anytime you're rejected, a job interview, anything like that, if you've been formally evaluated, then people know things. There's feedback that's available. And what we all want to do is just walk away from rejection with our tail between our legs. But if instead, what I did is I said, I was really looking forward to getting into that program. Obviously, I didn't. I'm not trying to fight your decision, but I would like to understand where I was short and what I could be working on so that next time I apply for something I really want, I'm in a better position. And somehow that attitude, when you bring that attitude, like imagine it's a job you really wanted and you didn't get, but you go to that same employer and you go, that's a bummer. I accept it, but I really wanted to work for your company. And, next time there's something, they kind of think, oh, that person had a really good attitude. So at any rate, after I had that discussion, this guy reached out to me, Professor Phil Miracle, and he said, I do all this work on conscious and unconscious processes, and are you interested in that? And I'm like, sure, maybe. So he sent me some papers, we had some discussions, and what I didn't realize at that time is that distinction between conscious and unconscious influences is so critical. And so one way to think of it easily is we have these things called the frontal lobes. That's what we kind of think of as us. That's where all our thoughts are happening, and that's where our conscious influences come from when we're intentionally trying to do certain things. It's our frontal lobes that kind of control that. But the frontal lobes sit on a much more primitive brain. And that primitive brain, and especially the limbic system of that primitive brain, that's where all of our habits and our instincts, but especially habits, things we do over and over again, that becomes what I think of as an unconscious influence. So it's not a Freudian kind of concept of unconscious. It's a cognitive concept, which is much more about, hey, if you drive that car over and over again down that same route, after a while, you don't even have to think about it. Your body and your limbic system just kind of takes over and does it for you. And so it turns out almost everything we do in life is this dance between the very primitive brain and the more evolved brain. And for example, during the pandemic and stuff, when I would talk to people about anxiety and some of the things that are going on, that's where you almost have to start. I start often by telling people, you are two people, and those two people are constantly wrestling for control of your one body. And once you kind of understand those two people and how they interact, then you're in a better position to kind of take some control, to be able to manage the way things are going on. Mm-hmm. So I now think that's a critical distinction about those two sides of our being.
Nice. Wow. I didn't even think about it like that. So have you ever run into any ethical dilemmas in your research? And I'm saying this because I'm trying to segue into animal ethics and what you think about that topic.
Yeah. So, I mean, so there's a few topics. As you kind of go through life, there are things you run into, and every now and then something becomes something that's a little special for you, something where you actually want to become an advocate. We may hit some of those topics that have run into that for me. But the first one was the animal research issue. I read a book called The Philosopher and the Wolf about this philosophy prof who adopts a wolf, which is a really bad idea, wolf pup, and then basically it's ripping his house apart and all this stuff. So the book is kind of an interesting journey through that. But he was the one that got me aware of this issue. And really what it kind of comes down to is we have two sets of ethical standards when we do research. We have a set of ethics that we apply to humans, and we have a set of ethics that we apply to animals. And the animal set allows far more intrusive work, allows us to do things like psychosurgery, opening their mind, removing parts of their brain, exposing them to high levels of stress, all of these things where if we did that to a human, we'd say, oh, you can't do that to a human. And so the core question that I started to wrestle with is, why? What's the basis? If you're a proponent of evolution theory, the notion is there's nothing really qualitatively different about us. We're all sort of life forms, and maybe we're more complex. Maybe we know we're going to die, and other animals don't know that. So there may be some things that are sort of uniquely human. But then you say, well, what is that uniquely human thing that makes us worthy of better ethical treatment? And you can start going through, we've heard stories about, oh, well, maybe we have higher cognitive functions. We use a language and they don't. But then you say, well, why does using language mean you get better treatment? And so what is it? And, we can get to things like consciousness and self-awareness. We've been talking about that distinction. Are we the only ones that have a sort of conscious mind? Well, to the extent we have research, the answer seems to be probably not. I mean, we don't know, but we know there's tests of self-awareness, and a lot of animals test this self-awareness, which is a sense of consciousness. So people could look at the mirror test or the rouge test. And so, as I thought about this more and more, I thought there is no distinction. The only distinction is that there's humans and animals. And so it becomes sort of speciesism, where, we will do things to a group that's not our group. And in this case, it's a species group. And it just seemed wrong to me that scientists should do that, because scientists should be doing things based on rational, reasoned, thought. And so if you're going to do something as extreme as have different ethical standards, there should be a reason. And if science is doing something like that without a reason, that scares me a little bit, because I like to think of science as a sort of level of purity. It's almost like, well, how can you preach to other people about things if you have a double standard that's a core of how you do things? Now, I also, over time, I like to have seminars where I talk about this, and often we invite neuroscience people and neuroscience faculty, and of course neuroscience faculty don't love this line of argument, which is great. I mean, I actually wish, honestly, that we could openly have this debate a little more, and I wish a lot of you guys could see faculty members debating issues like this. To me, that's part of what university life should be about. But it's really hard. People don't want to debate it. They want to keep it sort of as quiet as possible, because there are some extreme sort of pro-animal people that will sometimes engage in, destroying labs or freeing animals, and we don't want that stuff happening on our campus. So a lot of campuses want to keep it quiet. But I think it's a really good issue for engaging critical thought. And for me, I did a lot of animal research, by the way, as an undergraduate. And I did it without ever even thinking about the ethics. And so for me, that's really become sort of my position on this, which is I'm not saying it's wrong to do this. I'm not saying it's bad or evil, but I'm saying it is wrong to do it without thought. That if it's just indoctrination, if people are just doing it because everyone else did it, that doesn't seem right to me. It seems to me the people that are doing this should be thinking about it and saying, no, I think it's valid for the following reason. And I also felt like universities were not inviting that kind of thought. And I felt they should. And so when I get the chance, and it's only now and then, but every now and then I get a chance to get on a platform about this, and I love to do it. And it's a fun, provocative, it's a good teaching thing to bring in intro psych, get some critical thought in there early on. And but it's an issue down in the core I feel really, really passionate about. I think if we're going to get well in this planet, we have to respect other life forms. And that goes beyond each other. I mean, that's where it starts. I jokingly say John Lennon, when he said, all you need is love, he was shooting way too high. It would be great if we all loved each other, but he was shooting way too high. Aretha Franklin, RESPECT, that's what we need. If we just respected each other and if we respected the other life forms, I think that's where we start to kind of make things better.
So true. And I also wanted to add it because I believe that we should be hearing people argue different points in order to further something. I haven't heard anything about animal ethics the whole time I've been in university. Yeah. And to hear you speak about it now, I actually want to read into it more because I just know nothing about it and I haven't heard both sides. So that's something really interesting.
Yeah, that's part of that indoctrination kind of climate. You know, that's what indoctrination is. You present just one side and you just suggest this is the obvious side. Mm-hmm. And when it's an issue that should have two sides. And by the way, this goes back to René Descartes. I almost hate to tell this story, but it's a provocative story. It might get people to listen to the podcast. René Descartes was the first to suggest that we had that dual nature that we talked about, that sort of conscious, unconscious. He wouldn't call it conscious, unconscious. He would say there was sort of an animal part to us, but there was a soul. The soul could control the body. But he said animals don't have that soul. They are just complex biological machines. And he was the first one to make that argument. And so he started this process called vivisection because people were becoming very interested in how this machine of a body worked. And they thought, well, the only way to really know is to watch it working. That is to look at the inside of the body of a living being. And so that's a vivisection means to open while alive, basically. And so people started doing this with animals, and they literally would nail animals to boards and cut them open while they were still alive, which sounds horrific. And so when people were doing this, they would reach out to René every now and then and say, you know, they make noises, they scream, it's horrible. And this is always stuck in my mind. One of his pieces of advice was the first thing you should do is cut their vocal cord. Because then you don't hear that. But they'd say, but what about all the rest? And he said, that's not what you think it is. And the analogy I give students in class is if you saw a car coming down the 401 and then suddenly there was, a stoppage and it was coming way too fast and it had to slam on its brakes, that car, you would see it shuddering, you would hear all this dramatic noise, it could even roll over, you might even see this craziness going on. But you'd say, is the car in pain? And we go, well, no, that's not pain. It's just a machine that's under stress of the situation, and it makes those noises and does those actions. That's what René said the animal was doing. He was basically, he didn't have the car analogy to use, but he was basically saying all of that you're seeing, that's just the machine interacting to the insult, but the animal is not actually feeling any pain. Don't worry about it. Go ahead. And that started the vivisection debate, which used to be a big debate for years as people did it, but it just kind of pushed away. It got quiet, and the indoctrination kind of set in. So that's really my main issue is universities should be finding these issues. These should be great ones for us to all be talking about, openly debating in respectful ways, getting thought processes going. That's what we should be about.
For sure.
And on that note, do you think there are any viable alternatives that could reduce the need for animal testing?
Yeah, I mean, that's another, as you dig into this a little bit more, you start to realize, is this even the smart way to do it? Let alone correct or ethically. And I'll give you one example. There are a string of alternatives, and I actually have a paper about this somewhere. I don't know, maybe we could link it up where I talk about some of this stuff. But one of them, just to give people an idea of the modern times, a lot of animal research is done for medical reasons. And typically they'll do something like take a rat or whatever animal, they'll use some model of a disease, so they'll give it cancer or they'll give it epilepsy, and there's always questions about the way they do that. Is that really align with how we might catch something? But then they apply various sorts of cures, etc., to it to see what has an impact. Here's another alternative. What if every medical doctor who worked with every patient took really good records on, the genetics of that patient, the height, the weight, everything they could tell about that patient, and what did they do? And even if those doctors acted kind of randomly, if we had all of that data available centrally to mine, and even, like I say, even if they were acting randomly, and they probably wouldn't be acting randomly, they would have some intelligence to what they're doing, but we would see through the data that certain treatment options worked well for certain people in certain situations. And so we could start to tease apart, just with a big data kind of analysis in a real world situation where people are trying to treat humans, which is our goal of all this, what's working and what isn't. And right now, all that data is just disappearing in doctors' offices. It's not being all compiled, brought together, and able to be analyzed. But an effort to do that, in my opinion, would solve disease issues much quicker than the animal research approach we have. Now, the other caveat I also say, by the way, is what's the rush? Which gets people kind of going, what do you mean, what's the rush? But, breakneck speed of innovation or whatnot, we have things like cloning that, suddenly we're to a point where we can do something, and then we're going, is it ethical to do this or not? But we're already there, and we're already past there, and people are doing stuff like that. Sometimes I don't mind if progress happens a little more slowly. And that sounds horrible if it's your brother, if it's your sister or mother or father, and you're like, no, they have the disease. I want the cure today. Yeah. But if we cured every disease today, life expectancy would go really far up. We'd have to deal with all these old people that all you young people would now have to support somehow. It would cause another whole problem in society. That's another part of it is like, why does it have to be as fast as possible? But if it does, is this even the best way? And I'm not convinced it is.
So switching topics a bit here, what are some things we can learn about the psychology of addicts and sports betting in particular?
Yeah, so this is an issue. This is one of my current advocacy issues, and actually the most serious advocacy I've ever done, because I've never had this sort of opportunity, I guess. And it all started, again, I like my stories. It all started when, of course, I was watching TV, watching sports. I like to watch sports. But now all these ads are coming at us, and they were different than anything I'd seen before. It's not like you leave the sport and you go to an ad, and then you come back to it. It was so integrated that the sports casters are talking about bets and their over and unders and stuff. And, players were promoting various things. And I was just thinking about the kids watching this. Like, if you sit down with your child to watch a sports game, you are now indoctrinating. We're back to the indoctrinating. When they're presenting all of this stuff like it's perfectly normal, like there is no dark side, like this is fun, this is great, you can earn a bunch of money, you're indoctrinating these students and to associating sports with betting. Mm-hmm. And that's dangerous because betting is very dangerous. And just to sort of step there through the story a little bit, it's important for people because people think, okay, a psychological addiction, they can understand a biological addiction. That if you take a certain substance, your brain stops producing its version of that substance, so now you need more and more, and then you'll have a withdrawal if you ever, all of that I think people understand. Psychological addictions are very different, but just as deadly. And the core of a psychological addiction is random rewards. You hear about schedules of reinforcement in intro psych, and you think, okay, this is geeky operant conditioning. How do they give a reward? Who cares? But it turns out that random reward, this phone that every one of us probably has our phone within reach right now, and everyone listening probably has their phone within reach right now. We are all addicted to our phones. If you don't believe it, turn your phone off and see how long you can keep it off. And imagine you're an alcoholic who's been told not to have a drink, and you're just told not to look at your phone. You will behave a lot like that alcoholic, which means even if you can do it, you'll be constantly thinking about it. You'll be wondering what it would be like if you could look at your phone. You'll be doing everything an alcoholic would do. It's because you never know when something cool is happening on that phone. The cool things happen randomly. Mm-hmm. And when the cool things happen randomly, there's a really nasty effect of that. If nothing cool happens for a while, you don't give up. It's the reverse. You start thinking that cool thing is due. I mean, I haven't had a cool thing for a long time, so there's got to be a cool thing coming. And so you want to check more and more. And with the gambler, that's how it works, is once they try a few times, then they get some wins. And they start to feel like, oh, these wins come, but they never know when they're going to come. And the longer it takes to come, first of all, now they're in debt. They've lost money, so they want money more than ever because they've lost a bunch. But then secondly, the longer they don't win, the more convinced they are the win is just around the corner. Yeah. So that idea of stopping, which seems rational, that's what your conscious mind would do, right? Your conscious mind would say, I just lost $200 doing this. This is stupid. Stop, right? But your unconscious mind is like, no. These rewards come. We don't know when. It's right there. If you stop now, you're going to miss out on that. And that's what traps people. And the gambling companies are trying to do that. They're intentionally, you've seen some of these things where, hey, you get $200 for your first bet. Well, that sounds like a great deal. Why would they give you $200 if you bet 5? Well, because they know that's going to get you betting. You're going to start going through that 200. You're going to get some of those wins. You're going to establish that pattern where you start chasing the wins. So they know psychological addiction really, really well. And for us, it's like, okay, so should you say people can't gamble? That's what we used to do just 5 years ago. Gambling was illegal. But then they changed that. And when they changed it, they didn't realize how aggressively these companies would market. And it's beyond just marketing. They are in bed with every sport league. So the NBA has a deal with these sports books, the NFL, the NHL, they all have deals. Even Bell Media, the media companies, this is why it can be hard to have this fight, because some media companies are in bed with these betting books. They don't really want to, reduce the amount of betting. Okay, fast forward all of this. You got the context. The hero in this story is a gentleman named Bruce Kidd. Bruce Kidd was a vice president of U of T and a principal here at Scarborough, so he was our loyal leader for a while. He was also in the 60s, an Olympian in Canada. He was seeing these ads, and he was seeing what I was seeing, and he was annoyed, and he started something called banadsforgambling.ca. And that was an organization of people who were basically trying to rally the government to say, treat sports betting like you treat cannabis. So don't tell people they can't do it, but don't push it. Don't allow anybody to push it on people. And that's what the marketing is really doing, is sort of pushing people and convincing them to try this, and say, no, let people find it, but don't push it on them. And so we're trying to ban the marketing of these ads. And, the kind of interesting thing from my perspective here is I asked Bruce earlier, how can I help? And the first thing I started doing is reaching out to organizations like CAMH and saying, hey, would you write a letter in support of banning this? And I got a lot of positive vibes. And one of the things I reached out to was the Canadian Psychological Association and asked them if they'd do a letter. And they're like, sure, but why don't you write the letter? I'm like, oh, okay, that was a weird sort of twist for me. And they said, yeah, you're passionate about this. You be the CPA representative on this issue. And it's like, well, that's kind of cool. And so I wrote this letter that went to the Senate. There's a bill in the Senate, S-269, where they're trying to ban and change the marketing of this stuff. And that led the Senate to invite me to do, basically to be a witness. So I've started to see how government works, which is weird. All of these senators, and I was, by the way, very impressed with how thoughtful they were. There were a bunch of different witnesses. And they're basically asking all of us our opinion, and I got to represent the Canadian Psychological Association and kind of talk about the psychological worries. So that process is continuing, by the way. I'm giving a webinar on January 23rd. If anyone's interested, look on my LinkedIn page. You can find a connection with the Senator, Marty Deacon, and with Bruce Kidd. And we're just trying to rally the public. We know everybody's annoyed by this, but they seem to have given up. There seems to be a whole lot of learned helplessness, that this is just the way it is. And we're trying to tell people it doesn't have to be the way it is. We can pass a law that changes things totally. We can ban the marketing, and now is the time. And so we have this hashtag #WeTheOutcry, where we're trying to get people to be upset about this. Like, get upset, take some action. And yeah, so that's, I've never had that level of advocacy before, where I'm starting to have emails with senators and emails with ministers in various positions, which is kind of strange. But it is also kind of nice because it gives you a feeling like this is a feeling I want every student to have. I'm not going to get the quote right, and I think it might be Mia Angelou again, I'm not sure. But the quote is something like, if you don't like the way the world is, change it. And a lot of us don't think we can, but you can. Through advocacy efforts, you can have an impact on things. And sometimes it's slow. Research on animals is still going on. I don't know if that'll change in my lifetime or not, but this betting one might. It may change next year. And it might change because of what people are doing to bring the change to keep our children from being exposed to it. So, yeah, that's my latest advocacy horse, I guess.
For sure. I'm a big movie nerd, so I have to add this. I was watching Casino, I remember, when I was younger. And he said something like, the house always wins.
Yeah.
And that made me stay away from anything like that. And I always thought about it. You always lose in that situation. And it's so damaging to see that it's so promoted.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's nice that you mentioned that movie. Other people should watch that movie because related to your point, this is always stuck in my mind too. One of the things they do in that movie is they just don't allow anybody to leave the casino up. If somebody wants to leave that's up, they were like damaging their airplane or they were doing whatever they had to do to get them back into the casino. Because if they're in the casino long enough, as you say, they're going to lose. And so if you just sort of prevent them walking away when they're ahead, then you're always going to win. And yeah, that's absolutely, you know, people, I think with sports betting, people think, oh, I follow sports. I know sports. I've got all this in. I'm going to be able to beat this. The people setting those odds know sport better than you do. And they've stacked it for those. And so you're absolutely right. The more you play, the more you're going to lose, the more likely you're going to lose. Yeah.
For sure. And now we're going to dive into another topic. But
this is my life, by the way. I've got like 10 different things on the go.
I love it. You've done multiple TED Talks about teaching and the importance of education. So what are some of the most valuable things that you have learned from your students? Yeah,
so that's a great question. So let me start first by just, I've learned about the value of education even more than I ever thought. So, and I'm going to get a hint political here just for fun. When I look at the U.S. election, you know, I'm a big fan of democracy. And when I look at that, I think, how could this outcome have happened? Like how? But if you look at the voting data, Trump is supported primarily by people with low levels of education. And, you know, it just kind of smacks of, okay, maybe they're more driven by emotion. Maybe they're more driven by, you know, his always right kind of style instead of actually being able to think complexly about some of these issues. And so since then, I thought, oh my goodness, is education important? It's the key to democracy is having an educated group of citizens. Now, what have I learned from students? The biggest thing I've learned from my students, and this is UTSC. UTSC is so multicultural. People come here from all over the world, and of course there's all these different customs, and I could give you one sort of poignant example that always sticks in my mind. But what I've learned in general is, wow, there's so many perspectives on every issue, and you never know. So your current opinion about anything is your current draft. This is how I think of it. Based on the information I had so far, based on what I've thought about, this is where I am. But then when I have someone else in front of me that says I'm somewhere else, what I've learned is to shut up, get my ears open and say, teach me, tell me, let me understand your perspective. Because as you start to understand multiple perspectives, you get a much richer way of thinking about something. So let me give you that example, the poignant example, because it always stuck in my mind. It was a student, and it was, I think, an exam. And she said, I'm getting married, and in my culture, marriage takes a long time. It's like a 2-week process or something like that. And it's during your exam period, and we were talking a little bit. But then she mentioned that it was an arranged marriage. Now, I'm from New Brunswick. New Brunswick is, and in my day, it was a monoculture. It's just a bunch of white people who live life a certain way. And we thought arranged marriages were just crazy. Now, people can have different opinions about arranged marriages, but this person took the time to say, no, I'm quite happy about it. And she presented a perspective, a couple of things that I never thought of. And one of the things she said is, hey, in the West, you guys start your relationships with infatuation, right? You meet that person and you're like, oh, wow, this person is the most amazing. And you put them up way high on a pedestal that they can't possibly live up to. And then over time, as you're with them, you both kind of fall from the pedestal together, right? And you realize, okay, they're not that amazing. They're just another human being and that blah, blah, blah. And she said, you know, in the way we do it in our culture, I don't know this person much at all. My parents think it's a good fit. And so one whole question is maybe they're better at knowing what's a good fit than we are, maybe. So you could have different cultures, have different views on that. But what she said is we now have to grow together. So we as a husband and wife, you know, have these challenges ahead of us. And we have to get to know each other and grow. And so our relationship starts at the bottom and then goes up, whereas yours starts at the top and comes down. And so, you know, just that, whether you totally agree with all of that or not, just being like sit back in the chair and go, oh, I would have never come to that way of thinking about it if you hadn't have brought that to me. And that's what I learned from students here at Scarborough. I'm talking now to a guy from Afghanistan who's trying to help women in Afghanistan still receive an education despite everything the Taliban is doing. He teaches me every day. I want to help, but I don't understand that situation. You've been there. You know what the limits are. And yeah, I'm learning a lot from him. So those experiences, I think, are really, it's one of the best parts of my job, to be honest.
Wow. Amazing.
So as someone who has taught thousands of students, how do you handle anxiety, and what advice would you give to those who have trouble managing it? Yeah. Also, what does this say about the loneliness epidemic that we have today?
That's another advocacy issue I'm in the middle of now. Yeah. So first of all, let's start the anxiety talk this way. I gave a lecture every year that I used to call the psychology of being cool. Oh. And by cool, what I actually meant was, stopping that limbic system from hijacking you and you having all these emotional interactions. So one example we can just think of is, let's say you're in a relationship and your partner, for whatever reason, is doing something, and if they push your buttons the wrong way and you lose control, you lose your cool, you might say things that you ultimately really regret. So when people say those things like, I wish I'd never said that, they were almost always fight-flight reflex was kicked in. It's the limbic system talking right now, and they're whatever. So if you don't want to be, when I say the psychology of being cool, it's like not allowing that to happen, being able to push back. And I often talk about Barack Obama, and when he was on nationwide TV and somebody said, you lie, to him when he was giving a State of the Union, and the camera's on his face, and you see him go into fight-flight for a second. You see him ready to just, because he's the president of the United States, he deserves respect. But then you also see him pull back, and you see that Obama smile, kind of come out, and that's him being cool. And it's like, no, you're not going to get me. And then he responds in a way that we all find comfortable. So what's that about? That's controlling this emotional response, which is a fight-flight, this anxiety response. And when the pandemic came, I realized how many people were anxious and didn't understand it, because once you understand it, you can control it. That's a big preamble. So if we talk about teaching a lot of students, it is stressful. It's very stressful to teach a lot of students, especially now, by the way, because the pandemic has kind of messed with a lot of students. When they come in, they have very difficult social skills, which we can talk about, the social connection piece. And they're anxious and they're depressed. More anxiety and depression rates are a lot higher. And, through my actions, I can make that worse or better as a teacher in a class. But it's 2,000 people this year, and they're all unique people. And sometimes something that somebody would find comforting, somebody else would find offensive or whatnot. And so you have to, it's difficult. And the best thing you can do is to tell yourself, I'm trying the best I can to be, respectful, to be whatever, to do things in a way that doesn't kick up anxiety. But it is tricky. And so I certainly have to manage my anxiety. I feel like that's a weight that I feel. And the important thing I like to let people know is when you're feeling anxiety, that's cortisol and adrenaline filling your body. And that's supposed to get you ready for a fight. It's supposed to be an acute response. A bear steps in front of you. You're either going to fight that bear, you're going to run away from the bear, and then you're going to relax. But when it's chronic anxiety, like a course you're teaching for 12 weeks, that's always there, the bear doesn't go away. And so if you continue to focus on that thing that's causing anxiety, you will continue to have the cortisol. That is what breaks you down. That's what leads to, eventually you going from sort of an anxious state to a burnt out state where it's just like, I can't, I don't want to. And it's sort of a giving up kind of reaction. So how do you stop that from happening? Well, if you view that cortisol thing as a negative drug in a way, then you have to at least find ways of stopping its flow. So you at least kind of get away from it. And so sometimes with a course, that's kind of hard. But with something like the pandemic, I had to tell myself 1 hour of news a day. That's all you can watch. Because when you watch the news, you're feeding the bear. You're kind of feeding this kind of thing. So you might have to watch to get some information, but don't, try to diet how often you're sort of directly engaging with a stressful stimulus. But better than that, when you're not engaging with a stressful stimulus, can you find something that makes you laugh, smile? Singing, dancing, exercise, social connection is the biggest one. These all insulate us. When we're engaged in those activities, we get positive hormones flooding our body. And so that's like a pill. If you could tell people, hey, I have a pill that could help you manage your anxiety, you just have to do this once or twice or 3 times a week. I try to encourage people to think about like karaoke night with friends. Karaoke has social connection and has singing. We all laugh at each other. We whatever. If you go and do a karaoke night, once a week, that's therapy. That's like getting there and filling your body with positive hormones. And yeah, that stressful stimulus is going to be there the next day. But you have since flushed all the cortisol out. You're in a better position to now take on that stress anew. And so those sorts of things are quite easy to do once you understand it. I created a couple of so-called massive open online courses, one for the general public, one for police officers, one for healthcare workers, to try to kind of help them through that with the pandemic. It is something we can control, and that's what I would like to tell people. Of all of the things, for example, psychological therapy, if you look at how good is it at helping people who have certain situations, anxiety is what we're best at. We're pretty good at helping people manage anxiety, things called systematic desensitization people can look up, which means you can learn to do it as well. And so it's a great skill. Myself, I every day have an hour where I go down in the basement and play music of various sorts. I might be writing songs, I might be doing bass stuff, but that is my hour. My wife knows it. I've had a stressful day. That's where I go, and everything else disappears. And I'm flooding my body with those chemicals. So it's all different. It could be a cheesy little show that makes you laugh. Yeah. Masked Singer. If you love the Masked Singer and it makes you happy for that hour, that's medicine. Watch that show regularly. Try to find those things that make you feel good and use them like you would use a pill.
So on that note of alternate forms of therapy, what else would you suggest?
So with anxiety, there's sort of a couple of approaches. So one, the approach I've been talking about is sort of just get away from it and go somewhere else for a while, which is good. But the other way is you can directly take it on. And in fact, with the police officers, I do more the second one because they can't always escape the sources of anxiety. And so the other notion is first you have to learn the difficult skill of detecting that you're anxious. Because so often we get anxious, fight, flight kicks in, our frontal lobes actually lose blood flow, so we're not thinking rationally, we're not thinking consciously, our body is basically hijacked by the primitive us that takes over, and we don't even realize it. We're just in this fight, flight, we're trying to do something. And so one of the things I do with police officers is step one, buddy up, and start to play this little game where, if you and I were partners and I start seeing you getting anxious, I say, you're getting anxious. And invariably I tell them, you're going to bite my head off when I say that. And you're going to say, no, I'm not freaking anxious. And then you say, fight, flight. Right? So you kind of have to make that point. And that's sort of step one, people just getting to the point of, oh, okay, that's what anxiety feels like. And then once you can recognize it, you cannot be anxious and relaxed simultaneously. Yeah. And so rather than focusing on the anxiety that's giving it energy, if you focus on the opposite, relaxation, so you can learn specific techniques, they could be something as formal as meditation. Like meditation is a great thing for people to do to kind of control their anxiety.
I'm a huge fan of meditation myself, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's all sorts of benefits. It's clear from the scientific literature that meditation is a very positive thing to do. I keep trying. I'm not very good at it. My mind is just, shut up. No.
Yeah. Always running.
Yeah. But even, some of these sort of breathing approaches, like before night, you could look at guided relaxation things on YouTube, which will just sort of put you through a process. And it's a pretty easy process. You're basically clenching all your muscles, going through your body, clenching muscle groups really, really tightly, but then letting them go and feeling what they feel like relaxed. And when you do this for your whole body, from your feet right up to your shoulder, by the time you're done, it's almost like you had a massage or something. You're just laying there feeling totally relaxed. And the idea is to teach your brain that's what relaxation feels like. And if you can get familiar, you can get kind of intimate with that feeling, you can get pretty good at getting there without all of that guided relaxation. You can just kind of do what a guru would do or something like that, who can just take that deep breath or those 2 deep breaths and kind of put themselves in that place. And that's sort of my Barack Obama example. That's what he did, was just sort of gather himself, take those deep breaths, put himself into a relaxed state, out of fight, flight. That's almost like, I describe that almost like a Jedi mind trick. If you learn to do that, then you can always be the cool one in the room. And for example, when we were talking about debates with animal ethics, one of the things I'm good at not getting fight-flight mode in a debate. So people will come at me hard, and they'll say things that maybe even might offend some other people. And I try to be the Barack Obama. I try to smile, take the breath, and make my point. And if you're in any situation like that, if you're the cool one in the room, there's just a sort of respect that comes with that. People kind of look to you like, okay, you're being rational. This other person's being very emotional and scary and unstable. And so the stability, that psychology of cool is really powerful.
Thank you.
That's amazing. And I really love that you mentioned all these alternative ways of like helping with your anxiety. Me, I go to the gym every morning like a crazy person. I love to go every morning. Even biohacking, I've been looking into different methods of relieving anxiety, like Wim Hof. I recently discovered him doing ice plunges.
Oh, yes.
Oof.
There's so many things. It's just so interesting to hear about it. So that's really amazing.
Yep.
But I wanted to touch on something that I know all Sci AO1 students dealt with, peer scholars, which I loved personally. So what role do you think that peer assessment plays in fostering critical thinking and engagement in students?
Yeah, so the challenge always is, so you guys know I play a little bit of music, and when you play music, you go out and you want a big audience. You know, you don't want 3 people, you want a big audience. I'm like that when I teach. I like to teach to a large group. You know, I love being in the Sam Rebraham building now with 500 people all around you. That's just my happy place. I like that a lot. But if you like teaching large groups, then the question is, how are you going to teach them? Are you going to make it just a memorization course? Read this, multiple choice tests, whatever. And I didn't want that. I wanted to teach the big classes, but I wanted to have the things you're talking about, critical thinking, creative thinking, communication. I wanted students to have practice, because that's the only way skills develop, is by engaging them. And so peer assessment, the really nice thing is, you know, students are so used to being the ones assessed, which always feels a little like, you know, you're being judged or whatever. And it's almost an empowering thing to say to the student, no, you're going to be the teacher in this set. You're going to look at the work of your peers, and we want you to do the assessment, and we want you to try to give helpful feedback to them. It turns out that's a really powerful thing, and I'll walk through this sort of geeky list of stuff that we care about. But if to do that for one person's paper, you first have to read it carefully. We call that receptive communication. Being able to shut up and listen to somebody else is a very important skill. You have to combine that with critical thought, because you're trying to think of, is there anything I'm reading that could be better? And so you're kind of looking for, dare I say, weaknesses. I hate to use a negatively loaded term, but you're kind of looking for weaknesses in this work. Because that's where you can give some feedback. And so when you find a weakness, you now have to engage critical thought. You know, what could they have done differently? What would I recommend? Do I have any thoughts on how this could be improved? And so, you know, maybe you have to read through the whole thing, a lot of, again, receptive communication, a lot of critical thought, a lot of creative thought. You get to the end, and I always say just give one piece of advice. And so maybe you found 3 things. Now you have to use more critical thought to go, which one do I want to talk about? And then ultimately you have to express that. And anyone who's done Peer Scholar knows we have all of these videos that try to teach really respectful ways, because giving feedback's tricky. You can trigger the fight-flight really easily if you don't do it well. You know, if you say your work is really not that good, the person's not going to listen to a thing you say after that. You've triggered their fight-flight, you've been judgy, etc. And so we try to teach how to give feedback in ways. You can often trigger the fight-flight. It's a hair trigger. But you can try to do it with a lot of respectful stuff attached to it so that the other person will listen. Okay, so everything I told you about, all those skills that you engage when you do one peer. Now, if I make you do 5 peers, which is what I do, you know, you do all that for peer 1, and you do it for peer 2, you do it for peer 3. This is how skills develop. It's like playing a musical instrument or anything else. You got to do that thing over and over and over and over. And so Peer Scholar was really created to do exactly that, to exercise all of these core cognitive processes, both when you're giving feedback, but then, of course, there's another step where you receive feedback from your peers. And what we're trying to teach you there is something in education they call a growth mindset. And so this is work where they looked at a lot of famous people, and they noticed that, you know, from Michael Joorden, you know, all these people you can imagine. And I almost told you an example of it from myself early. This notion that when they fail, let's say fail, what do you do when you fail? Do you run away from failure, or do you choose to learn from failure? And it's very hard to choose to learn from failure, because you got to wallow in the failure a little bit. You got to accept, you know, I didn't do as well as I thought, blah, 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 but there's a potential here. And they found that a lot of people like Michael Jordan and others would have that, what they call a growth mindset. They would be able to get past the negativity and get to the actual thing that could help them do better. So that's what we try to teach you in the final stage of Peer Scholar, where you're looking at the feedback and we make you do things like tell us how upset that made you, because you have to recognize the fight-flight. Like, oh yeah, and then we say put it in your own words. What that person was saying to you, put it in your own words. That forces your frontal lobes. That's us talking to your frontal lobes. This is a task for you, frontal lobes. Forget that limbic response that's getting you all upset. What's the person saying? And in order to do that, you have to kind of engage the frontal lobes. And by the time you do that, if I say, what she basically told me is, I didn't read the instructions well, I didn't do the assignment properly, I really kind of have to start from scratch. That's what she's saying to me. Now, whether I agree with that or not becomes another step, but at least now I've recognized the feedback that I'm getting, and then we ask people to make appropriate changes to kind of use that feedback, and then ultimately to kind of express, here's what I did and what I didn't do with these various things. So that's our kind of game with Peer Scholar. But the thing that's so heartening for me is, you mentioned going to the gym. If you go to the gym once a month, you almost might as well not go to the gym. Almost might as well not. It's something where for a skill to develop, it needs regular practice. And so for me to see so many courses using Peer Scholar, so that I know you run into this in psychology, but then you're in chemistry, a completely different context, but we're still engaging these skills, we're still practicing these skills. And then you might go to an English class. So I think at U of T now it's like 80 or 90 courses per term that are using it. And of course it's now used in 10 countries around the world too. So it's just kind of mind-blowing, just to, something that's come out of our lab that we created, that we wanted to do something, other people get it and they're using it, and it's impacting, we think about 300,000 students a term now. And so, yeah, that's kind of cool.
No, it's really effective. I remember even when I first did it, I just felt like I was given the power finally to actually evaluate something. Didn't really do that much in high school. I felt like I was always just receiving information, never really applying it and actually evaluating things. So that was amazing.
If I can jump on your point there, one of the major things we're trying to do right now is to get this to high school, because there's sort of a silliness, not silly, I don't know this way, but imagine we wanted to make you all great basketball players, but we said, and we're going to start when they're 17 or 18 years old. Okay, but you're not going to get that good if you start. If you want to be a really good basketball player, you got to start at 12. And so if critical thinking, creative thinking, communicate, and especially communication skills, which we'll probably talk about more, if they are so important, we should be teaching them at 12 and 13, not at 17 and 18. So the sort of Peer Scholar experience should be happening in your high schools. And so I'm now working a lot with TCDSB and in Peel and a number of other places. It's tricky. Suddenly you have to become a business person. You have to become, a bunch of things you never want to be in order to have the impact that you want to have. And so, yeah. Hopefully, high schools will change.
Yes.
So as a professor in 2025, what are your thoughts on AI in education, and how do you see it complementing or complicating the teaching-learning dynamic?
So fascinating. So it's kind of funny. I'm going through my career. I'm feeling okay about some of the stuff I've done. And then AI comes out. My first reaction, like everybody's first reaction as an educator, is, oh my goodness, this is destroying things like writing assignments. Like that's a core thing that we use. How are we going to do it? And so it always begins with depression, begins with, a lot of your teachers probably associate AI with cheating.
Yeah.
And that's sort of as far as they've gotten. But I reached a point, and I talk about this now in keynotes that I give to teachers and stuff, where I started playing with it. And I would recommend anybody who feels fearful at all about it, start to play with it, because something that happens is your fear turns to wonder as you start. So I started using it like writing songs. And I'm like, I have a song with it. How would you change these lyrics? And then it throws lyrics at me. I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. And then eventually you start to realize what it's good at and what it isn't. And then you start to see the opportunity. So I'll say wonder is the bridge between fear and opportunity. And so you start at fear, but as you go down that bridge of wonder, you start to see opportunity. And right now, I see so much opportunity. And so I've come to a point with AI where I really associate with Thomas Kuhn. So Thomas Kuhn had the idea of what he called paradigm shifts in science, that every now and then science is done a certain way and everything's fine, but then something happens that makes that old way of doing it not really work anymore. And then suddenly people have to come up with new ways of doing everything, and the whole enterprise goes through this huge shift. I think we're in the middle of that shift right now.
Sure.
A lot of the ways we did things in the past are not working very well, and it's causing a lot of stress on, I cannot tell you, faculty meetings. The faculty are scared, like, what do we do about AI? How do we deal with this challenge? I tried to deal with it in my class. I think I could have dealt with it better in my fall class, to be honest. So, even me who kind of lives in it, I think I underestimated some things. But so much opportunity. And so one of the as one example that we're playing with right now, we're creating this bigger platform called Talk Lab, which we could talk about. But as one part of that, we rolled out, it's kind of weird, this virtual version of me for the students. And basically the idea was 24/7 sort of office hour support, that you could just connect with this. And one of the things we've done with that is you can only talk to it and it will talk back. You cannot text. For reasons we might get into, I consider text a really dangerous thing that's messed up so many people. So, and we can talk about why. So I want to backfill that by making students have conversations to get things they want. They have to engage in conversations. And so he will converse with you. He's virtual Steve. And you can ask him any question about psychology. And we're like, I don't know, will students embrace this at all? And we found, I think, something like 1,300 conversations he had the day before the exam. So students were just coming, and we look at these conversations, and they're all very academic. They're exactly what you'd want. You know, he's giving really good advice. But another interesting thing we found, so this sort of hits two things. You know, this AI is now, first of all, giving you a 24/7 office hour support that would have been impossible otherwise. And secondly, it's giving you that experience talking, which I think is so important. But thirdly, we started to realize that people started to ask it things like, I have trouble with distraction. I start doing things and I'm distracted. And it would give good advice. It would say, you should check out the Pomodoro technique and you should do blah, blah, blah. And these are other things people are using. And we're like, oh my goodness. Not mental health advice. I wouldn't say mental health advice, but I would say the challenges that students are facing. They're sometimes asking questions, and it's giving them, like, loneliness, for example, friends. We saw someone say, I'd really like more friends, and it said, well, your university probably has clubs and things. You could consider looking for a club that aligns with your interests, and you can meet people, and it's less stressful. And I look at some of these interactions, I'm like, crud, man, this thing's amazing. And so is it suddenly, if we did equip it to do mental health stuff better, could this suddenly become an anonymous, because it's completely anonymous, you just log in and it doesn't know who you are. Yeah. And so could you go there and get good advice on issues at scale, in privacy, without stigma? And that's something like 5 years ago we would have wanted to get to, but we wouldn't have known how. And now suddenly when we're playing with this, it's like maybe this is a how. And maybe every course should have one of these personas, agents. It's never clear what to call them. But that's one example. And I'm going to give you one other example. This is the ghost of Christmas future, so to speak, where I want to go with this because I think it's really important. I hate multiple choice exams. Multiple choice exams assess learning in a sort of shallow way. We use them because they're logistically, they allow us to take a 2,000 student class, assess 2,000 people in a short period of time, get a grade back. So there's usefulness to it. But what if instead, at the end of some learning experience, you had to log in and talk to one of these agents, and it would interrogate you about your learning? Oh, you've been learning about memory. Okay, let me ask you some questions. And so it would ask about breadth questions, but it would also go deeper to see how deep you could go, and it might even ask skills questions. Hey, if this was some data from a memory experiment, could you figure out the sensitivity, whatever? So it could do what we call a holistic assessment of learning, really get at everything we value. And then ultimately, that's how we used to assess learning before multiple choice tests. It was always what we call viva voce, through the voice. It was oral exams. Can we now do oral exams at scale, so get that scale benefit of multiple choice, but actually assess learning better? And so this is the paradigm shift of Kuhn that I kind of see. I think over the next few years, we have to change our assessment methods. We're going to change our teaching methods. We're going to change the kind of assignments we ask you to do. And I think 5 years from now, we're going to say, wow, AI hitting was great. It really helped us, because the current education system, it's not like it's perfect right now. Yeah. There's a lot of things that can be improved, and I think this could be the kick in the butt that kind of gets us all there. It's uncomfortable during that period, though. It's a tough time.
The transition's always hard.
The transition's tough.
We were all really excited, actually, to hear about Virtual Steve. Could I ask you a little bit about what it was like to train the virtual version of yourself?
I have to say the name Adam Frost right now. So Adam is my postdoc, and none of this would be happening without Adam. So it's really, as a prof, you only have so much time, and I would love to say I could have dove deep into AI and created something like Virtual Steve. I simply would not have had the time. So Adam really jumped in. There's not as much to it as you would think. It's basically some LLM behind it, like ChatGPT 4.0 or whatever. We sometimes use different ones for different. We're not allied to any one of them. But it basically has that core. But Adam has added interestingly, what we've been talking about, an emotional system to it. So our bots, like if you're used to the ones that you interact with, they are what's called helpful assistants, most of them. And they'll say yes. They're very yes people, whatever you say. And if you say you're an idiot, he'll say, I'm sorry, I'm an idiot. How can I be less of an idiot? So, really very, very submissive, whatever. We wanted originally to build these agents as conversations, as a way for students to practice having human conversations without the scariness of talking to an actual human. So we wanted a safe practice space. So Adam said, though, conversations, they kind of flow. It's not like you're talking to the same person the whole time. That's one way of saying it. The emotional, maybe the person's getting bored of where you're talking and you kind of sense that they're bored and you change your topic and you go to someplace. And so there's an ebb and flow. And he said, we need our agents to have that ebb and flow. And so we need them to be emotionally responsive to your emotional states. And do a little bit of neuroscience just for fun here. It turns out that you can describe almost every emotional state through this sort of circumplex of emotion based on just two things, arousal and valence. So how powerful is the speech and how positive or negative. And so you can imagine, for example, the difference between sadness and anger would be arousal. So they're both negative emotional states, but anger is a lot more aroused than sadness is. And same with ecstasy versus being happy or something like that. That's an arousal difference. And so what he has is another agent monitoring the conversation, and it can tell if the student, it can tell its level of arousal, it can tell the valence of the things it's saying, and it responds and reacts in return. Mm-hmm. So he's created this system, and then we added this voice to it. So there's something called Retail AI. It's a company that adds the human voice to it. And it's remarkable. I don't know how he did it. It's like we're ahead of Google. It feels like when we have these interactions, it's like, how did we get ahead of the Googles and the whatever? Now I think they're catching up pretty quick, which we know they will. And it was never our intent to sort of have the best of that. But Adam has really done an amazing job. But it is basically ChatGPT with a verbal interface and then a little bit of special sauce to make it all feel more human. For Virtual Steve, he then does another thing that I'm not sure how powerful it is, but he scrapes my voice. so it views a bunch of stuff and it kind of gets my voice. And I don't know if it doesn't sound like my voice to me, but other people say it sort of is. But it also apparently scrapes my style, how I say
how
things.
You talk?
Yeah, so a lot of the, like for example, and I don't know how much of this is true because sometimes it's flattering. I was having an interaction with him the other day and I said, my goodness, Adam, one thing I noticed is he's continually complimenting me. He's continually like, if I throw an idea, that's an interesting idea. Let's whatever. And so there's a lot of very positive reaction to almost everything I say. And I'm like, he's so freaking friendly. He's so nice. I like, and I said, where did you get that? How did you get that in? And he says, that's you. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm that good. So I never know, but that's the sort of process I guess he uses to do it. I give you a sense of just some of the applications. This is the weird thing. We're now talking to a bank, I'll say a major bank, who trains tellers, and Adam can now create these upset customers that basically come to the teller and for whatever reason they're angry. It's got an emotional system, and of course their job is to sort of de-escalate, calm them down, give them information, and they have to get trained on how to do this. Right now, they bring in actors to kind of do that, and they're very expensive, and it's unclear how good it is. We can almost immediately say, we can do this at scale. We can give you these agents that they can interact with and learn those skills. And so suddenly, that's the AI world. You play around a little bit, and suddenly it's like, whoa, there's all these applications to what we've done, and then you got to figure out what you're going to do, what you're going to prioritize. Wow. We kind of went around a long road.
It was a good route, though.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about texting, actually, because that's interesting. My dad would love the fact that you said you don't like texting. He hates it.
Yeah.
I just want to get your opinion on that.
I think this is something, we hear a lot about how social media gets us into this judging thing where people are worried about being judged all the time, and I think that's an important thing. But I haven't heard enough people emphasize this point. When you text, and you guys have grown up with texting as a primary form of communication, probably the primary, it's probably the biggest way you communicate. And we'll see. You can tell me how much you resonate with this, because I've had to be taught by Adam, by the way, so I didn't grow up in that world. And so sometimes Adam is my, you got to understand. He's sort of my bridge a little bit. And what he uses the word ruminate. He says when young people now interact, if they're going to send a text to somebody, they think long and hard about what they're going to say, how they're going to say it. They may even type it and then look at it and decide what emojis to add and what not to add, and does this imply whatever? And so they get sort of hyper analytic about what they send, and then hyper analytic about what comes back. So when something comes back, it's like, did they really mean this? And so you're putting all this time and effort and thought into communication, and that's become a habit. And then you get to a place where you have to do what we're doing, and you guys are all pretty comfortable apparently doing what we're doing, but face-to-face synchronous, right? And you don't have the time in synchronous to do that. You just have to say things, and you have to accept that sometimes you're going to say things and it's going to come out wrong or feel stupid or land flat or whatever. And, Adam would say that the biggest thing we're trying to teach students is how to accept that and just keep going forward, not to realize that's part of conversation. That's how it goes. We can have a podcast where everything sounds fantastic, or there might be a podcast where there's kind of low points and then it raises up again. And that's how real-time interactions are. And so, how do we get people who have these habits, these rumination habits? We know social anxiety is really high. Like really high. I've looked at it in my class twice now. The average level of social anxiety is at the point where a therapist would provide treatment. That's the average student is right there. And we know what's driving it. It's something called the fear of negative evaluation. You think you're not very good at this because of these habits. I don't know how to do it. I'm not going to do well. That person isn't going to like me. This is going to go bad. I'd rather just not do it. And so that's why people aren't practicing. So a lot of people are just not, they're isolated, they're living isolated lives, they're very lonely, and they know they just want friends. But that process of just sitting down and talking to somebody that they don't know, they can't get past that. And so how do we get them past that? Well, we want to build competency. So that's the notion of using these agents, because the agents don't judge. Right? So suddenly the fear of negative evaluation is gone. You're just talking to a robot somewhere. Who cares if there's a flat spot or whatnot? So maybe that will provide an opportunity for practice. And in the bigger, we've talked about Virtual Steve a little bit, but in the Talk Lab platform that we're really starting to develop, we try to do this more intentionally. So we might, for example, we would have a module where we teach students about something called active listening, where we say, hey, when you're in a conversation, you guys are, by the way, they kind of do this to me, by the way. When you're in a conversation, if you're worried about how the conversation will go, here's an approach you can use. Kind of pretend you're a reporter or a podcaster, and whoever that person is, try to get their story. Ask them questions, and then follow up on that question and go deeper. We all love talking about our story. You invite me to do a podcast? I'm like, sure. Want to talk about me? Sure, let's do that, right? So we all love sort of talking about us. And if you ask those questions, first of all, you get a deep conversation. It's not about the weather anymore. You're starting to get to actually know that person. Secondly, because it's about them, they're going to be happy. You're going to sense that this is going well. And so we can describe here's how to do it. And so now it's in your frontal lobes. It's useless in your frontal lobes until it's in your limbic system. It's got to become a habit. It's got to become a skill. And that's a lot of what my research is. How do we transform things into skills? And you transform them from practice. It's just like Peer Scholar, different world. And so the Virtual Steve, again, one example, they have to talk to it. We just want them to practice. We want them to start to feel like, oh, okay, this is going all right. This feels a little better. And with Talk Lab, we have specific exercises. So one of the examples of the active listening is, you are now a biographer. And here's a selection of people, and we have a group of people, and they include people like Taylor Swift or whatever. We don't know if we're going to get in trouble at some point. Maybe Taylor will support what we're doing. I don't know. But the idea is you're a biographer, and she's agreed to sit down, and you have an opportunity to interview her. And you want to try to find something interesting or different or whatever so that your book will be unique. So here she is. And so they just have this interaction with a virtual Taylor Swift. But it's an opportunity for them now to practice that active listening, to see how it works in a safe kind of environment. And then, of course, we say, next time you're at Tim's, try this with the person that isn't Taylor Swift. Give it a go. And that's where we ultimately want to get people, obviously, is a point where they're comfortable reaching out in the real world.
Yeah. As a journalism student myself, I really do like the reporter analogy. And I think having the ability to reach out to strangers and kind of experience that rejection is very helpful, and in terms of regular social interaction. So yeah,
for sure.
I really appreciate that.
Even especially with social media now, everybody's not talking to each other, and I think we need to talk more, especially because networking is such a big part of life. That's how you get anywhere in life. And I didn't realize that even coming into university, how important it is who you know rather than what you know sometimes. Yeah. Actually, most of the time. So
Yeah.
That's great work. I'd love to see that because more people need to talk.
I want to punctuate that point too, because it never stops. It never stops. So for me, I talked about wanting to get Peer Scholar into the high schools. If you're a prof, especially with sort of education chops, you go into a high school, they're like the teachers are rolling their eyes. Here's this prof from U of T. He's going to come tell us how we should be doing stuff. And so, I learned early on that no, don't do that. Go in there, shut up, have big ears, and realize you're a tourist in their world. But exactly what we taught you got to network, you got to meet these people, you got to make some friends, you got to build relationships. If you ever want to have an impact on life, you're never going to do it alone. Mm-hmm. You're always going to need other people. And so being able, it's never comfortable, but being able to feel, okay, I can go into a room full of people I don't know, and I can get past the discomfort. And it's not like you're going to get to a point where you're never feeling discomfort, but you'll get to a point where you'll realize, hey, when I step out of that room, I'm going to step out with 3 or 4 new people that are going to be important and helpful to me in some way. And so there's great value in that. And every now and then you might actually find you like a real friend. Mm-hmm. And those real friends, as we may talk about, are so important. They are the best variable for sort of insulating us from stress. If you have a group of, it doesn't have to be a lot, 3 or 4 people who you really love, that really love you, that they're there for you, then when stress happens, those are the people you share it with, and you literally share it. You literally offload some of your stress to them, and if they show that they care and they react well. So that's such a powerful, powerful force to kind of keep us sane. But now as everybody's becoming more isolated and you say nobody's talking, that's where, by the way, the talk is where the nonverbals come in. The nonverbals are our limbic system talking to each other. Mm-hmm. When you're texting, that's the frontal lobes talking to each other. But when I give you a story about something difficult I went through and you go, oh, that sound says, I was listening, I was with you. I was listening to a point where I was with you. In fact, I was with you so much I felt the same emotion now that you felt then. And when we feel somebody is sharing our emotional state, that's what creates trust bonds, and that's what makes us feel safe. And so human connection is so very important. I work a lot now with the GenWell Initiative, which is a not-for-profit that's all about trying to educate people and empower them around how important social connection is. But it's also seeped into intro psych this year, where we have projects where we work with GenWell and all this stuff, because I think this is another major thing for me now. And in fact, by the way, I'm happy to report that the provost and dean here, the dean at UTSC and the provost at U of T, have heard of what we're doing in intro psych and some of the stuff Adam's doing, and they love it and they want to support us big time. And so UTSC, we have the challenge of trying to how do we get people talking at U of T? How can we take this campus and really kind of get that social connection? And that's a fun challenge as a researcher, to try to think, okay, I want to bring this campus to life, so to speak. And that's our challenge for the next few years.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, on that note, we want to get into more personal and fun questions. It says fun here, but I think I've had so much fun just listening about
this whole podcast.
It's amazing. But if you want to take that away.
If you could collaborate with any historical figure in psychology, who would it be and why?
Yeah, I saw this question. I'm like, oh boy, that's a tricky one. I mean, the one that always amazed me was William James. William James, during his time, was really almost more philosopher than psychologist, but we think of him as a psychologist. Well, he is a psychologist, but he didn't do a lot of experiments. He was sort of an armchair kind of guy, but he would sit and think about memory and say, I kind of think memory works like this. And he would do all this sort of introspection or whatever, and he would come up with this theory. And then, 50 years later, when we have the ability to test some of the things, so many of his theories were accurate. So he's just really amazing at sort of thinking through things and nailing them. And so it'd be kind of fascinating to sit and chat with him a little bit. Of course, it'd be fun to talk to Freud. I don't think it would actually be fun to talk to Freud. Freud, if you didn't believe him 100%, he wasn't really happy with you, and I don't believe him 100%. So maybe that wouldn't work out. But there's so many sort of interesting characters, and every now and then I teach the history of psychology, and I think I find it more interesting than the students, unfortunately. but I like all of these characters that come along and all the little challenges they've taken on. Yeah, I almost want to mention now Bluma Zygarnik. Let me mention Bluma Zygarnik because she's an unlikely. She was an Ivan Pavlov's student. For all of you who struggle with procrastination, check out Bluma Zygarnik's work and the Zygarnik effect. You all know it every day. So the Zygarnik effect, by the way, is the simple thing that when we have unfinished business, it keeps coming back to our mind. And you can use that to conquer procrastination. If you just start something, then your mind will keep going back to it and it'll want it to finish. And so there's all these techniques you can use. She, if you think of every series, every Netflix series or whatever, what do they do at the end? They have what we call cliffhanger. That's unfinished business, right? Something's happening and now you don't get to know how it ends until next season. And they're using that because that brings you back next season. So for her time, I think Bluma did some amazing work that still is relevant to every student today. So it'd be fascinating. She probably spoke Russian, but it'd be fascinating to speak with her.
That's amazing. As an author yourself, what are some pieces of literature that inspire you? This could be movies, books, anything.
Yeah. Wow. So one of the unfortunate things about being an academic, unfortunate, I'll say it that way, but your reading time tends to get consumed with textbook material for courses or papers that you're reading. So you get really overwhelmed, and it's hard to find that sort of fun reading time. Now I did mention The Philosopher and the Wolf. That book had a powerful effect on me. I generally like things that mess with my head. I like reading things that sort of maybe go against what I currently believe, not necessarily go against, but at least present a perspective that's different from the perspective I usually share. I love hearing from other cultural voices and other things. So anytime I get an option to be exposed to something that's unusual that I haven't thought through, or at least haven't thought that way, I kind of like it. But it's hard for me to just list a bunch of books or authors because I don't read as much as I would like to. I have to say, not for pleasure. If I'm sitting around, at 11 o'clock at night alone with the TV in front of me, I'll end up on YouTube and I'll end up usually watching musicians, like old videos from the 70s or 80s of musicians that I like, and I like hearing the biography of musical people. I creativity in general. I'm interested in creative people. So yeah, that kind of stuff.
Speaking of, in one of your TED Talks, a guitar is used as an example of an educational tool. What are some hurdles you find when teaching yourself new skills?
I mean, the biggest hurdle is almost the procrastination or whatever, just doing it again. Like, we all want to be at some end point where we were like, oh, I love the idea of being on stage and doing a show and being really good. And it's like, okay, if you want that, here's the path. And this path, involves, and I told you, like, every day I go downstairs for an hour because I've taught myself that's the only way you're going to get better. You can have people come over and play with them, but if that's all you do, if you have a band come over once a week and you play, you're not going to get very much better. You can only do so much in that 2 hours you have with the band. If you're not doing the 5 hours through the week, so that those 2 hours you're ready to really make the most of it. Yeah, I mean, that sort of thing. I've really taught myself to appreciate the things that are difficult. You also mentioned the gym. I now, as I got older, one of the most important things is to maintain some muscle mass and other things. And so during the pandemic, said Tuesday mornings and Friday mornings, that's a meeting with me. I have a 2-hour meeting with me where I go down in the basement, do some aerobic work, do some weight work and stuff. And I used to find that really hard. But as you make it more of a habit, and you see that it gets you where you want to go, and for me, that's being healthy. For okay, we're gonna go here for a second because this is one of my favorite quotes. It's actually from Confucius, I think, where he said, "We all live 2 lives. The second one begins when we realize we only live one." Mm-hmm. Sounds a little Confucius-like, but really, there is a point you reach in your life where the inevitability of death and the sort of how many years away it is strikes you. And that's when you realize, oh, I only live once. And, oh, I may only have 15 summers when I can ride my motorcycle somewhere because, I probably won't be strong enough at some point in time. So that's 15 things. So it starts to be a count. How did we get here? Oh, yeah. So that's with things like the working out thing. I realize I want to be healthy for those 15. I don't want to just allow myself to get to a point where those 15 are 5 because I'm not healthy after 5 years anymore. And so by sort of, I realize that it is the journey and the things that seem difficult about the journey, if you learn to kind of embrace them and the change that goes with it, that's what becomes the fun part in a weird way.
Wow. It's very inspiring.
Very much so. honestly, I hear a lot of people that are always like, I'm waiting for the motivation to do something. I'm waiting for the motivation. And I always tell them consistency and just showing up for yourself, no matter whether you're motivated or not, is what's going to make you successful in anything you want to be good at. So that's a great point.
Yeah. Turn it into a habit.
Exactly. And do you have a favorite memory from your time as a student or early on in your career as a researcher?
For my time as a student, we would have already shared probably that Wayne Donaldson memory, which, by the way, he now lives in Northern Ontario, and so we get to see him every now and then, he and his wife, which is kind of interesting. He's much older now, but it's become a lifelong friendship. I tell this story every now and then, so he always likes to hear that story. Other memories, I mean, I bartended all the way through university, and one of the... I think first, so again, it was University of New Brunswick, which is still mostly monoculture-ish, but a little better than New Brunswick proper. But we would work for Africa Night, for example, and it would be all the African students. And so first of all, I got exposed to a bunch of music I would never get exposed to. But even funny little interactions. So some of them became really good friends, and it was often over. I think that was my first sort of cultural divide and learning how to interact with it. And one example that I always remember is you'd put out a tip bowl as a bartender, and the African students would be like, "What's that?" There's a bowl there with some money. I'm like, "It's a tip bowl." Why is it sitting there? And it's like, well, sometimes people give you a little extra money when you serve them. They're like, why would they do that? And we're like, I don't know. It's just not in their culture, right? And it started to feel, and we started to ask ourselves again. It's almost back to that whole notion. Well, why do we do that? And you see a behavior through the eyes of somebody else. And it kind of makes you think about things differently. So I think those African nights, I always used to love to work with them because I always felt like I came out of them different somehow. And I think that's what multiple perspectives, when you do take the time not to try to argue with somebody, but to just listen to them. It's that active listening again. I want to understand the world as you see it, because that's going to help me see it in a more multifaceted way. And it's a gift. If you're giving me a different perspective, I may not agree with your perspective, but if I just shut up and listen first, then I can think about what I think. That served me well all through.
So now we're going to ask some rapid fire questions.
All right.
Dr. Joordens, are you ready?
I feel like I should have a bell or something. Yeah.
All right. What's your favorite sports team and player of all time?
Wow, I like so many. So generally, I'd go to a Team Canada, and I love the Team Canada soccer team now. But but when we get to a player, I'm going to go to the Raptors and Vince Carter. And I know Vince Carter is a little controversial in some ways because of how he left. But what I always like to say about Vince Carter is when we watched him in the day, he did things with his body nobody had done before, as far as flying through the air and turning around. And I didn't like watching Vince Carter. I liked being Vince Carter. It's like mirror neurons or whatever you want to talk about. When I watched Vince Carter, every time he was flying, I was flying. And when he was slamming things down, I felt that same exuberation he felt. No athlete has made me feel as connected as Vince did in that one. So,
wow. I'm going to follow that up with who's your favorite musician or band? I know you love music, so...
I'm all over the board, but that's sort of an easy one for me because it's Neil Young.
Oh, wow.
Neil Young, authenticity. He's a warts and all kind of guy. So two bands I love, Neil Young and Pink Floyd, they're completely different. Pink Floyd's like high production, whatever. Neil Young is put the recorder on, grab a guitar, and let me lay a song on you that's just going to mess with your head a little bit. And so I've loved his authenticity. I love who he is. If I could sit down and talk to somebody, I'd probably like to talk to him, although, it's not clear you always want to meet your heroes. So sometimes
never a good idea sometimes.
Yeah.
Which of your friends would you like to turn into an AI model themselves?
So the friend no longer exists, just the AI model?
No, both.
Oh, they both exist.
You can be a colleague as well.
I mean, what I would love is like an AI model of John Lennon that I could chat with and write music with or something like that. That would be my first thought of, who's something. But this does, I mean, I'll go a little weird personal thing here to talk about how some of the opportunities of this sort of AI. I've just found out I have this minor heart issue. It's not a big deal, but I learned about it, and I felt like I was immortal until you learn about something. You're like, oh, what the heck is this? And I reached out to Adam right away, and I said, I think I need you to spin me up a cardiologist. Can you find the best cardiologist on the planet, and can you make a virtual version of them so that when I have questions and stuff, I can, and that's the opportunity that almost exists. So when you ask that question, I'm thinking who would I like to talk to that I couldn't normally talk to? With my friends, I don't think I want a virtual version of them. I think I'd rather just have them.
Oh, that's nice.
That's sweet. Next question is, what's the most fascinating brain fact you've come across?
The most fascinating brain fact. Wow. I mean, there's cool stories around things like deja vu and stuff that I like to tell, or even I'm going to lose the Capgras syndrome. Capgras syndrome is probably let's do Capgras syndrome because it's sort of the weird. So the idea of Capgras syndrome is almost like the conscious unconscious. When we encounter somebody or something, there's a recognition system that gives us sort of conscious information about that, and then there's this unconscious feeling of familiarity. If you've seen this, there's a Tim Hortons cup in front of me. If you've seen this Tim Hortons cup over and over and over again, you can recognize it very quick. It feels right, etc. In Capgras syndrome, those things can get split. Now, a lot of people know about prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia is where you could recognize someone's face, but they don't feel right. So you have the conscious. Am I getting this right? No, I'm getting this wrong. So with prosopagnosia, you have the familiarity, but you can't recognize the face. So it could be your brother after you've had some sort of brain, and you'd be like, oh, person feels really familiar. Could be a movie actor, could be whatever, maybe a family member, but you can't peg it down. Capgras is the weird opposite one. So in Capgras, you recognize the person, you know who they are, but they don't feel right. And people, this is what makes it sort of spooky. People have done crazy things like kill that person if it's their spouse. And they kill that person because they want to show the rest of the world that this is really a robot in their spouse's outfit or an alien that's taken over the body. It's not really them. And when they keep telling people that, I know it looks like my husband. I know he sounds like my husband. I know he acts like, but he's not. I can tell. And people are like, no, he is. And they're like, I'll show you.
Oh my goodness.
and they do extreme things. So that that just sort of shows us how important it is for those things to come together. And when things get derailed, it's kind of a fine orchestra the brain does, and it's quite easy to kind of throw it some direction and see weird things happen.
You mentioned computer science and music production in your early student life. If you weren't in psychology, what would you be doing today?
Yeah, that would probably be it.
Yeah?
I'm trying to think. There's a couple of career fantasies, I guess. The other one would be working with sports teams and trying to sort of do sports psychology kind of stuff, trying to bring out the best. I've always kind of wanted that from when I was very young. I think that would be fascinating. But those would be the two. And the reason music production, by the way, is as I've seen the life bands live, and it's not necessarily a very good life. I didn't really desire this being on the road and doing all this kind of stuff, but I love the creativity of it. And I thought, well, if they do all the hard work and I get to work with them and help produce something cool, then that would be great. I could go to their show now and then, and that's enough for me. And so I still have that fantasy. If I retired, that would be kind of a fun thing to do.
That's amazing. And I'm just going to ask one more question. If you had unlimited funding for one project, what would it be?
Right now it is around that social connection kind of issue, and really trying to crack. It's like we're all being driven away from each other. We're all living more and more isolated. We think it's safe, it feels safe, but we're losing that social connection and we're going insane. And so trying to reverse that process in a world where text is still going to be there, social media is still going to be there. How can you help people not get into these bad habits? And so almost like Peer Scholar, when we were talking about going into the schools, with the social connection thing, we also want to go into the schools. We also want to be working with 12-year-olds and having them have these verbal interactions all the time and make it maybe even part of their learning. So here's sort of a crazy example with unlimited funding. Imagine you're taking a history class as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, but you can actually talk to the historical figures. We bring them each to life. And so rather than reading about it in a book, you're given some assignment. I want you to go talk to Einstein, and here are the things I want you to find out. And so go and have an interview with Einstein, learn a lot from him. And so they're practicing the verbal skills. It might be a more engaging form of learning. They might like it better. And that's the kind of thing I would be doing, is trying to get that sort of thing down to the 12 and 13-year-old level. And that's challenging when you're a university professor because they are different cultures. And everything I talked about and everything we've talked about, you have to go in there. You got to learn to be very respectful. You got to make friends. They have to work with you, not for you. You know, you don't command teachers. Teachers have enough on their plate, and they don't need to listen to any stuff like that. So they have to be, you know, full partners in it. So that's a lot of work, a lot of time, and it does take a bit of money. That's where I'd be.
For sure. So that wraps up our episode for today. A big thank you to our guest, Dr. Joordens, for sharing his insights, experiences, and passion for the field. It's always inspiring to learn from those who are shaping the way we think about psychology, education, and the world around us. I'm Melina.
I'm Faryat.
Thank you for tuning in, and until next time,
keep your synapses firing. Whoop, whoop.